So to introduce our panel today, on the far side is Geoffrey Strickland, who's Group Compensation and Benefit Manager at Asahi. Next to him is Mark Chamberlain, Group Reward Director of SIG Group. In the centre, I'm sure many of you recognise Duncan Brown, who's Head of Consulting for the Institute of Employment Studies. Next to him is Rachel Smith, who's Senior Labour Market Economist for the CBI. And closest to me is Masha, Boldyreva, who's HR Director, Northern Europe for Mondelēz. So those are our pay experts. We're going to try and focus on pay in terms of your main employee population, not get too much into exec rem, which is the panel that follows us. But of course, it's very hard to divide the two. And I think probably we shouldn't be dividing the two, which is an interesting debate that will come up in the next little while. So I'd like to start with Rachel, because the CBI has done some interesting research and some of the trends in this area about what's being impacted on pay, the living wage, gender pay equality, pension costs, etc., etc. Rachel, can you give us 2 minutes on the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I thought I'd just start off by talking a little bit about the current climate that businesses operating in, and therefore the climate that you're kind of thinking about setting your pay and reward strategies within. And I guess you could use a number of words to describe 2016. You could say it was interesting, unpredictable, challenging, but I think there's one word that we could probably all agree on, that it was quite uncertain. And I think that will continue to be a key theme as we move through 2017 this year. But as ever, I think businesses are resilient, and we kind of work it with the context with which we're presented. And actually, 2016 wasn't too much of a bad year for the economy. Growth was at 2%, but then we expect that to soften a little bit throughout this year, moving back to kind of 1.3%. And that's due to a combination of things like businesses putting investments on hold or pausing things, and also consumer spending just falling back a little bit as inflation rises. So it's above the Bank of England's target at the moment, and that starts to eat into pay packets at the till. And the reason I mentioned that sort of first off is because actually it's business performance and competitiveness and ultimately productivity that sets the scope with which you have to reward your people. So it's important just to mention that and just kind of reflect on the fact that productivity still is quite weak, and therefore that has an impact on the pot of money we have to pay people. And I think that's reflected in the latest ONS data, which puts pay growth at regular pay growth, so excluding bonus, at 2.2%. And then when you take into account inflation, that drops back down to 0.2%. And then we've done some research looking at how firms are thinking about rewarding their staff in their next pay round. So we did it at the back end of this year, so it's the data sort of speaks to this year. And we found that most firms are expecting to make awards in line with RPI inflation, so about 40% thinking about that, and then a further 17% looking to make awards above inflation. So an okay picture, not fantastic, but then a further group of firms, around 1 in 5, planning to make targeted pay awards. And I think that speaks to the fact that skills shortages, talent shortages are starting to bite. So firms are very much having to think about, okay, well, if we've got this pot of money, how do we reward people? How do we attract the right staff and keep our key talent, particularly as demand for higher level skills keeps increasing, and as I say, those skills needs intensify. But those, I think, are also pressures that are very much in the here and now, and the title of this session was thinking about 2020. So I think the challenge for us all in all of our work, whatever profession we're in, is to always kind of do things in the here and now and do our kind of our pay rounds and our benchmarking that always comes up year after year, but then also to try somehow to find the space to think about the challenges that are coming in the future as well. And so to take one of those challenges, demographics is a key one. We know that people are living longer, staying in work longer. We'll have a range of different ages of people within the workforce, and indeed kind of the diversity of the workforce is increasing, and with that comes different demands and wants and needs from work. So I guess the key thing is then to kind of think about how that impacts on how you reward people when people want different things out of work. How can you respond flexibly within the kind of the bounds of cost and affordability to reward your people, to engage them, because we know that engaged people are more productive.
Great. And then just sort of picking up on that theme, Duncan, I know you've got some views on some of the political and economic issues that people are grappling with at the moment, be it on gender pay, be it on the various changes, the Taylor Review and so on. You just expand on that.
Sure. I think, as Rachel said, you've got that really difficult situation, whatever your sector at the moment, of what we called out of a piece of research, we did the cost talent crunch, where those cost pressures are still intense and competitive pressures on business. But labour, we've got record employment levels and skill shortages emerging in more and more areas, and that's a really tough balance to address. And I guess what we've seen since the financial crash is the way that that's been addressed is basically hold pay costs as low as possible, and HR and reward folks are getting scored really for all low pay awards. But I think what's coming out now from a kind of national perspective is that ain't good. If you look at, why are we such an unproductive economy? Why, could the French go home on a Friday and still produce the same amount of stuff as we do? It's not because we're paying people too much. It's the reverse. We've got one of the highest proportions of low-paid, low-skilled workers of any of the major OECD countries. And, that's why we're seeing the amount of talks that I'm doing at the moment on intervention and labour market intervention. This is an extreme right-wing government, guys. Why are they intervening? They're not doing it particularly because they want to. It's because they've been pushing at you voluntary measures, Think Act report on gender pay. The last election, give Britain a pay rise. That was David Cameron saying that, not Labour or the left. And yet, you didn't, and therefore we got the national living wage, the gender pay gap hasn't been closing, and so now we've got the reporting legislation. Deborah's take on it was very interesting as well, but I suspect over time is really going to motor into it. So I think the message that's coming to me from it is that HR has really, rather than just repeating the kind of business mantra, being the business partner, we have got to start thinking about adding value and actually investing in people, which in traditional cost speak may actually be costing us more. But there's a whole ton of research that says if you invest in the right ways in people, the proportionate returns to the business are much higher. But that's a tough tension, I know, to manage on the ground when you've got these sorts of immediate cost pressures. But I hope we're going to see shift to talking more about investment rather than costs in comp over the next year or so.
Which brings us neatly, Masha, to something you wanted to raise, and that is that ROI, and making sure you get the ROI on your reward spend.
Yes, I guess we, in my organisation, in Mondelēz, you would know it as Cadbury, probably, or Kraft. We've changed names a few times. We faced quite significant pressure a couple of years ago when we set out to grow a lot, but didn't. And one of the things that we found as a reward team is that we spend quite a bit of time responding to pressures such as legislation, various changes in tax environment, etc. We also do spend some time with our boards looking at the future strategy of the company. But one of the things we didn't do enough was just taking a step back and looking at our existing reward levers and asking very simple questions. What are we trying to drive, and is it working for us? So we set out to examine one of our bonus schemes, actually, a bonus scheme that consistently runs across through hundreds of thousands of employees. And what we found was we had to be prepared to be reminded that we employ human beings and not human doings. And we decided not to do it through a survey, but just speak to employees. And what was fascinating is that the belief in the organisation about what that bonus scheme was delivering was completely unreal. So we had to face up to some truths, inconvenient truths actually, after having proper conversations with the employees and realised that it wasn't driving the investment. We actually weren't getting anything from our investments of hundreds of millions into the bonus scheme by simply just asking those questions and talking to the employees. And then we changed the scheme. We completely redesigned our bonus scheme globally on the back of that. But it took some convincing to do, because it's very difficult as an organisation when you spend so much money to simply acknowledge that actually it's wasted. So it was quite a bit of convincing to do with our executive level to help them understand. And one way we achieved it is by putting videos of employees talking about it.
So that's also links to the whole idea of cost pressures. And Mark, I know that you've got this question that you asked is how do you remain competitive when you're trying to attract talent, but you've got to manage your costs on pay?
Yeah, I don't know if any of you know of SIG. We're a business which is most probably about 30 years old, quite a confederation of individual businesses. We are specialist suppliers in the building trades, provide building supplies to the building trade. And we have relatively high turnover in terms of 3 billion, but our profit is about 75 million. So, and we were supposed to make about 100 million this year. So going to the board or going to the executive committee and asking for money to invest in pay is always a bit of a challenge, particularly when you've got 2 profit warnings. We've had 3 CEOs this year and 2 CFOs. However, it's very short-sighted not to invest. The way we try to do it is to look at efficiencies around how we build our business models around procurement, supply chain, and efficiencies around that, and then we invest the money back into our business. So this year we managed to get, it doesn't sound a lot, but it's better than nothing, 1.5% for our pay increase. We got the same last year, but the senior leadership team didn't get anything last year. So it's really hard to get that investment, but as reward and HR professionals, if you're not banging the drum about, investing in people, effectively around pay, fundamentally, because if you can imagine a lot of our workers are minimum wage or above, blue collar, warehouse operatives, therefore base pay is fundamental to them. Then before you know it, you are really on a bit of a slippery slope in the business, that you've got disengaged people, higher turnover, which has a more significant cost of recruitment, and your business starts to spiral out of control. So it's been a challenging year. What we also still build on as well is, because reward is one aspect of it, pay is important, and particularly for people who are lower paid, because it's food on the table. But it's important that you build on the value proposition. People talk about the EVP, but authentically talking about it. I mean, interestingly for us, we have a branch network. We have typically people who would go and work in retail, but yet we don't work on Saturdays. That's quite a selling point to come and work for us if you're in that kind of industry, because it means you can get to go and play football, you have time with your family. So we build on certain things like that which help, keep people retained. And our attrition at the moment is between 20 to 25%. And if you can compare that into retail, that's not a bad turnover, really. So it was looking at more creative ways to engage with people, but recognising me as the reward director, if we don't invest in our pay structures, our benefit processes, our infrastructure around that, we will lose people and we will have to invest more money. So it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, that you've got to continue to build that case. And particularly this year, I was quite pleased because it would have been so easy to say, no, you're not paying anything. CEO's gone, CFO's gone, we had a profit warning. It's quite easy to say, we're not going to pay any money. So although it was 1.5%, we managed to get it. But it was a tough sell, as you could imagine.
Interesting. Well done getting through that. I'm going to open questions to the floor shortly, but I wanted to ask, Geoffrey's coming with a slightly different angle, having more of an international role. And so one of the things that he comes up against, which I'm sure many of you do, is this idea of having to have a sort of a global pay policy when locally UK legislation is quite prescriptive, and how do you marry the two?
Yeah. And it actually ties in with what Mark and Duncan have been saying as well. In this question, you could take the UK and replace that with a sort of single country. So it's that balance of trying to have a global philosophy and a global policy which, sitting in the centre, reward you want to do, because then you know what all the countries and the markets are doing, and it's nice and neat, and we know that everyone's offering this as a benefit and not paying at this quartile and whatever. And then, of course, a country will come to you and say, well, I've got an issue because we're facing a local pressure, because there's a bit of local legislation that says a national living wage, or we've just lost a CFO and business performance isn't great. Can we have a special exemption to do this, that, or the other. And it's trying to get that balance between, I think, the central global guidance, but also at the same time allowing the local freedom, and in some cases the local prescription, because the local markets and countries will come and say, we have to do this because this is what local legislation says. Now, Asahi is a brewer, so for a beer company it's actually quite easy, because we can simply say to people, here, have more free beer. And that seems to go down as a good international language. But the last few years of my career, I've worked for a couple of brewers, one being SAB Miller, and I was working very much in the centre, so setting the central policy and then directing that down to the local markets. And it used to really annoy me when a local market said, no, but we need to do this because we're different and this country's special. And now that we've been taken over and acquired by Asahi, I'm now in a region working up to a Japanese parent. So, of course, I'm now the one going, well, we need all these exceptions. So I've seen it, because, of course, the UK is special and different. So having now seen it from sort of both sides of the thing, I think it is getting that balance between that central guidance and framework, which you absolutely need, but also allowing the local freedom and recognising that local legislation impacts such as national living wages and local issues actually really do shape the structure as well, and affect how much you can pay and how much you can afford to pay.
So our panellists have laid out their stall. You've got a feeling of where their expertise lie. So get onto your Slido asking questions that you've been wanting to ask, because we have got a real group of experts here. In the meantime, if I could have the questions that are coming through and we can start answering. I think, Rachel, you touched on this idea of productivity, and we've got quite a straightforward short question. Does increasing pay increase productivity? And it'd be interesting to hear perhaps what each panellist has to think about that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So from the research the CBI's done, we would say that it is productivity increases that are the way to drive pay increases. To give you a quite a straightforward answer, I think the productivity growth needs to be there to then deliver the pay rises. But it's not always that simple, and I think it can sometimes work a bit of both ways, because you can see how actually if you increase pay a little bit, then you can engage and motivate people, and then that can boost your productivity. So I don't think it's always as straightforward as it might seem at first. So yeah.
Geoffrey.
We have a production facility in the Netherlands making beer, and there's an interesting thing there. We have an issue is probably the wrong word, but we have a length of service case there where a lot of the employees have been with the company for a long time, and they are quite highly paid. It's a unionised workforce. They've all had quite hefty pay increases, and actually quite generous pay increases over the year. But actually, that's one of our least productive breweries. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for that, but I think in my experience, there isn't just a simple link between increasing pay and productivity. That's not to say if I went to one of our low-performing breweries and actually doubled everyone's pay overnight, the productivity wouldn't improve. I'm sure it would do. But I think it's getting that sustainable improvement, and I think it's not simply pay more and get a sustainable long-term productivity increase.
What productivity is looks different in different roles. Yeah. So for some people who, say, if you take like a creative role, being productive there is actually quite hard to put your finger on and measure, versus if you're on a production line and you can quite clearly measure how many of this or that that's been made in a day. And I think that can make it difficult to sometimes translate changes in pay to changes in productivity and work out which way the link is running. And then I think you can add in the added complication of the other costs of employment that make it difficult to link pay and productivity, so precisely like your pensions cost, like national insurance, etc., that muddy the water as well. So yeah, it's challenging.
Just putting on Geoffrey's point about sustainability. I think that's the key thing. You give someone a pay increase, they're quite happy. A few months down the line, they've absorbed it, it's in there. And I think there's other aspects, again, back to value proposition, about being able to give freedom, autonomy. I mean, if you're interested, I talked about our business putting in more efficient operating model around supply chain procurement and logistics, which is fundamentally what we do. But what we've done is taken away some of the ownership and accountability in the branches, which has decreased productivity. Even if you increase pay, it would still decrease. So you've got to get the kind of whole picture to balance, is what we've found. And I don't think pay per se does create productivity.
Masha, then Duncan.
I would have to agree with that, actually. We had 1 year a few years back when we had a 0% increase for everyone. And the year that followed that event was probably one of the most productive years. So, and I would go back to the point around the human beings, I guess. It really does depend on the individual. You know, you deal with some top talent or depending on life stage, for some people a pay increase really matters and it does boost their motivation. But I think to your point, it will probably wear out within 6 months and it will go back to fundamentally the things that motivate us, which are less about money. It's more around the cause, the people, the opportunities, the values, etc.
Would you mind if I move on to the next question, Duncan? Because I want to address it to you. And it's about the ratios between your board directors and the rest of your employees, just that I'm aware of time and I want to cover as many questions as we can. So the questions come up, should we adopt a regime used in many countries whereby the CEO can never earn more than 30 times the lowest paid employee? And perhaps you can answer that almost from the mass employee one, because I know that's probably going to come up as a question on our exec rem panel after this one.
Sure, yeah. I think the pay ratio issue, there's two issues really. Is it of value measuring it and is it of value publishing it? And I think there's a lot of arguments with people saying, indeed I was on a review group that Will Hutton looked at in the public sector, and our brief was, should a cap of 20 times minimum pay in public sector bodies, not average, which tends to be the measure that's used in the private sector and which is the measure coming in the US, is 20 times cap desirable and should we put it in? And that group varied quite a lot from political perspective, but from an economic perspective, the answer quite clearly was no, because if you look at the range of public sector bodies and the different activities they're carrying out, as in the private sector, the nature of the activity itself actually has quite a big impact on what the ratio is. Having said that, in a particular sector, why one organisation chooses to pay its senior people a hell of a lot more than another competing organisation, and whether that has any effect on performance. The answer is we just don't know, because the information has never been made available. And actually that whole debate about is it relevant or isn't it, until that information is out in the public domain, we're not going to know. I think there's increasingly circumstantial evidence that there can be demotivational effects from very wide differentials in organisations, but it's not a straight 15 times is good, 50 times is bad. Because if you look, say, at the organisation which has got the lowest ratio in the FTSE, it's 3i. And the reason that ratio is low, because average pay is about 100 grand. So, you know, it doesn't say anything about pay at the top. So simple issues of just a benchmark ratio, a uniform benchmark ratio, no. But I think employers paying a lot more attention to the relationship between the top and the middle and the bottom of the house, with, as we'll find out, I'm sure in a minute, exec pay having kind of got removed on its own bubble, and we've all seen the downsides of that, must make sense, I think.
So, another good question. There are quite a lot of good questions. I'm trying to rattle through them here. If we are to address gender pay and skills shortages, and perhaps national living wage as well, will there be any money left for anybody else? How are you balancing all these different challenges?
With difficulty, I think, is the key. I mean, there is pressure for us, obviously, with national minimum wage. Potentially will go up more than what RPI or whatever the mechanism we use to set our budgets. I think business needs to think more commercially about how they operate. You know, if I look at the business I've joined, it's very set in its ways about how it manages its processes and its business transactions. So if you can think smart about the way that you work, and you can convince the board and convince the operating board that any money which is saved through those operational efficiencies you reinvest back into your workforce in some way, shape or form, I think everyone's a winner. The challenge is setting expectations of your investors. And I know we're touching maybe probably a little exec rem here, but at the end of the day, they want a return on their investment. And yet you've got the dichotomy of having to still meet some legislative requirements, and some which are driven a little bit by some of the institutional shareholders. So, you've got to kind of paint a holistic picture about, okay, we can only make this amount of profit because we need to reinvest it back in this, in terms of our pay structures and benefit structures, to drive longer term growth for the business. So I think that's one creative way of trying to do it, but inevitably it does become a little bit more challenging once you start to include investors in pay decisions in the business.
Do any of the other panellists, Masha, have you got a view?
I honestly think there will be less money for, so in the sense, we're already facing it, there won't be money for everything that we're doing, so I guess it's driving us to be more choiceful, which takes us back to the return on investment, asking the question, what is going to bring most value? That's certainly what we've had to do. So perhaps removing some benefits that probably least values and replacing them for the ones or upping or investing to pay rises. So we've got a lot of operational costs drivers that we're trying to save costs. It's very difficult to get them to be reinvested into people, because what you're trying to do is invest into brands and other things that are actually driving the hard cash so that you can deliver to the shareholders. But I think the choicefulness piece is something that we're all having to face a lot more. So it will be less money, we'll be offering less, I think, but they will be, what we offer will have to be really spot on and focused.
So what happens when Brexit comes along? We've got a question here. Brexit, skills shortages, we've got high employment already. How are you going to attract staff when there isn't much money to go around? Anybody want to tackle that question?
I think in our sector, again, we employ, most probably a higher proportion of Europeans coming into the country because, of the type of work that we do have and some of the skill sets we're looking for. And inevitably, supply and demand will drive it up. We've basically had 10 years of fairly low pay inflation, which has been quite good in some aspects, because from a commercial point of view, you're not investing in your pay from a commercial point of view. But, I remember the days back in the 90s when it was 5%, 6%, 7%. And that's around the corner. And I think what we need to do is in terms of our businesses is make our investors and our board and our stakeholders aware that there is an upward pressure coming in here. And we do need to continue to invest. And Brexit will compound that, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's something in eking out more value from what you are doing already as well, because I was just thinking back, we're doing some work at the moment about what work looks like in the digital age to come, and I was just thinking, actually, is there a way to kind of communicate to your employees the value of the package that they're already getting? Because I think sometimes some parts of the reward package become kind of just you forget about all these extra benefits that you're getting. So, for example, I don't know, days of holiday that are between Christmas and New Year that are additional to your kind of allowance, or like not having to work on a Saturday. Is there some way to kind of use digital technologies, particularly where you've got workforces that are on different sites or maybe on the move, to emphasise and allow them to have greater choice over their benefits, but also a greater awareness of what they're getting, and that helps you to differentiate yourself from your competitors when there are labour shortages or skill shortages?
I think one of the good things maybe about the whole Brexit debate, and let's face it, we don't know, because nobody knows what the effect on the labour market is going to be and what sort of controls will come out of this. But a good effect has been it's given a shock to employers to think, what actually is our labour market? So all of you will do market pay surveys. That's the outcome. What about the underlying labour market? Because actually, if there's a shortage of supply, if firms like yours are not investing enough in developing and training people, then whatever you pay, there aren't going to be enough people to go around. And I think we're certainly seeing a trend now for particularly bigger employers to actually have a look at that underlying labour market. Where are you getting your people from? How many are there out there? Are there enough out there? And what strategies have we got to actually address that, rather than just, we're a little bit below median, move up to median? Because certainly if we get a shock from the way that Brexit is implemented, then a little pay rise, even if you can get it through the board, is probably not going to address the issue. And investments in skill levels, off-the-job training is pretty much flat on 2008-9. It hemorrhaged then and it hasn't recovered. So not only we're not investing in pay, we're not investing in skills in the way that we did a decade ago. And that at some stage, that's going to hit the labour market.
Masha?
Yeah, so I guess to your point, we work in R&D and packaging is one of our most challenging areas. It's already, without Brexit, it's quite a skill shortage. So one of the things we're doing is we're partnering with one of the universities up north and trying to actually introduce a degree so we can attract more and more students to that so that we can have a bit of an inflow. Because we've now exhausted sort of poaching from our competitors. There's only so far you can go, and if they're not coming up. And the other piece that's interesting for us, we've got a shared services centre in Birmingham, and it's got about 200 employees, and the vast majority are there Europeans because of the language skill set, because they service 33 European countries from one location. And one of the other things is, I've got 2 daughters, I'm pushing them to learn other languages, because language capability is something we need to all be looking at, actually, and encourage, because that's one of the reasons we can't hire people locally, because of the language skills that we need.
Interesting. So we've landed up on a learning and development training element, which, in terms of total reward, absolutely crucial. I'm going to draw the panel to a close now, because we've got to do some nifty switching of mics and things. But huge thank you. We've barely brushed the top of the iceberg on pay, but hopefully useful and interesting to all of you.